So we've had some time to sort of digest the AMD launch to kind of see how this was going to go. And although AMD had a significant amount of inventory versus NVIDIA's 50 series launch, as expected, it's all sold out. And as expected, brands are raising the prices once again. The all-new Silent Loop 3 from Be Quiet is finally available in the United States and features a new damped pump design with a 6-pole motor for ultra-quiet operation, giant cold plate with Threadripper compatibility, tasteful and minimalistic RGB design, and is available in 240, 360, and 420mm variants, providing plenty of cooling for even the most demanding CPUs of today. The refill port and provided coolant mean you never have to worry about evaporation leading to pump failure, providing a longer life and less downtime and cost for your rig. To see the full list of specs and features, follow the sponsored link in the description below. Okay, so this is going to be kind of all over the place, to be honest. Feel free to even minimize this video and just listen. It's more of a talking head rant, if you will, but food for thought for consumers. Lots of messages from people asking, is 9070 XT worth it? If it is it worth going with the custom models? What's the difference? The same kind of questions that we see every time there's a new family of GPU launch, especially if it's someone kind of new to PC space and they're just kind of confused on what to do. So like for instance, on the table here, I had kind of like a small, medium, large of the 9070 XT specifically. So the Power Color Reaper is like technically an MSRP model. Well, it was at $599. Apparently the price on that is going up at a lot of retailers. Then you have the Sapphire Nitro Plus, which is like upper tier. And then I think it was supposed to be like $729, but I think it might be more than that now, I forget. And then the XFX Mercury Magnetic Air, which is like the most expensive model for the 9070 XT. And so the question and the concerns, we go, which one should I get? The MSRP or the custom models? And unfortunately, that's not a very cut and dry answer this time around for a couple of different reasons. Problem number one with the 9070 XT series is the fact that there's like two specs when it comes to power. And now power limit is a big factor when it comes to how far a GPU can boost with its clock speeds and such. So 304 watts is the actual TDP spec for the 9070 XT. 220 watts on this 9070. We're going to talk about the XT because it's the one that technically has two different numbers. But brands can go as high as 340 watts. I'm sorry, logically, after the 5090, it seemed like that might be where we're going next. But anyway, yeah, so 340 watts is what is available to brands to sort of like play with. So now one of the biggest issues you're gonna have is if you go and look up a particular card and you just look up 9070 XT specs, you're gonna see 304 watts as the power limit for the family of GPU. But I know for a fact the XFX and the Nitro Plus have a 340 watt TDP. But my question is, for a lot of the MSRP models that are out there that are going to be sort of following a more reference spec, is it 304 or is it 340? So that's a problem for me because this is the first time we've really seen a different number based on kind of like the tier of the product. So let me kind of back up a little bit here. NVIDIA, in almost every single graphics card minus the 5090, for the first time it like comes out of the box pretty much max spec, like all the custom AIB cards. So even like the 5090 Astro OC has a 100% power limit slider. It doesn't go any farther because it's already maxed out the power delivery capability of the power delivery system to the card, not necessarily the card itself. But just about every model will ship with whatever the TDP is, plus an additional power limit slider, at the very least. Some brands can go a little bit higher. They might go higher by like anywhere between 5 to 10% power sometimes on the lower end models, but it's not explicitly said by NVIDIA, you have a 304 or a 340 watt, you decide. NVIDIA basically says all of them must meet this minimum requirement, and then based on their custom board designs, they can decide to beef that up a little bit. Now, that sounds very similar to what we're dealing with right now, but this is like, NVIDIA doesn't say, oh, but you can't go higher than a such and such number. And that's kind of what AMD has done here, where they've said 304 or 340, depending on your designs. So there could be a significant power, like performance difference between 340 watts and 304 watts. So I think what we're gonna have to do here now is I'm gonna have to take like our XFX card here, which we did all of our testing on really started at the top of the stack, honestly. One of the reasons why we didn't do the power color right away is it required a BIOS update and such, and we do need to review this card as well as the Nitro Plus, because you might very well see varying performance ranges that are outside of just a few percent based on those power limits alone. So I feel like what I have to do now is take the XFX card, limit it to 304, and then see what kind of differences we get in terms of clock and average frames per second, 1% lows, 5% lows, and all that. So that's where I feel like you might be seeing a range in quality and performance based on MSRP cards. Now, of course, there's no money at MSRP for any of these brands. In fact, problem number 2 for AMD is a lot of the AIB partners now are stating that they are not able to continue to provide cards at MSRP. That MSRP now was only a launch price. In fact, you can go watch Steve's video. Steve did a great video where he actually kind of like extrapolated and compiled all of this data from different SIs as well as different retailers, stating like, hey, we were only able to do the initial launch at MSRP and then prices had to go up for whatever reason. AMD is stating we're enabling the manufacturers to maintain their pricing, but nobody really knows exactly what that means yet. Not only that, AMD can't control the pricing. They can only control minimum price. They really can't control the free market anywhere where there's, free market in the world, Europe, Asia, US, the Americas, obviously. Retailers can charge whatever the hell they want. Whether that's double the price or $10 more, they have control over that. They just can't go lower than the manufacturer is stating you can sell it for as advertised, but they can sell it for lower as long as they're not advertising it for lower. So it's just really all kinds of gross and hard to follow for a lot of people, understanding how pricing works. But now knowing that you could have a card that potentially is going up in price and potentially perform significantly different than a peer card, simply because you don't really know, because it's not advertised, which is a 304 and which is a 340 watt. Okay, so I wanted to sort of test the 304 watt versus 340 watt thing here real quick, because the issue, as mentioned, is they don't put those specs in the box. It's 9070 XT. This is a 9070 XT. This is the 9070 XT. These have very different prices and very different TDPs and such. So these are both 340 watt. This is a 304 watt card. So I threw it on the test bench, and here's where things just kind of get weird. So far in just the few titles I've run already of our suite, and I'm going to be doing a full suite of it because I need to have these cards on my charts. The power color at 304 watt TDP is actually beating the XFX Mercury Magnetic Air at 36 watt less. So there's a couple of reasons that could potentially be, and I haven't dug into the data yet to really kind of figure it out. It's funny because it looks like this card is actually even at a lower frequency than this card. Because if the frequency charts, when I compare frequencies with the 9070 XT and the 9070, well, the non-XT, it was actually, this card, the XFX card, the Mercury, was hitting over 2900 megahertz and then dropping down between like 28 and 29. Right? It was advertising like an almost 3,000 or whatever. Mine was just like 28 to 2,900 around there. This card seems to be landing right around the mid 2750s and maybe bouncing up to 2,800 and back down to 2,750, which makes sense because the lower power limit means overall lower voltage because, right, voltage in amps and watts are how you rate power. My only theory is that it could potentially be a more stable clock, which could mean better frame times or more consistent frame times, which could give you a better average. Because it may be almost like its own little undervolt, if you will. We all know AMD graphics cards love undervolting. And if you have a really good ASIC quality card, you can undervolt it, usually keep the frequencies where they are and become very power efficient. So it's almost like this card might be potentially like at the 304 watt spec, undervolting in some way. Now the difference we're talking about here, and I'm not gonna put these charts up yet because they're not done, I have to validate all the data once they're collected, it's like less than 1% higher than the XFX card. But still, the fact that it's even landing at the same spot as the XFX card, which is a $150 more technically, is kind of showing how a lot of times these super custom designs are just not worth the money. I've talked about this in the past, going way back to when custom cards, like the high-end custom cards, were only like $100 more than the reference models. Let's go back to like, say, the 980 Ti. I believe the 980 or even the 980 was like $549, somewhere around there. And then the 980 Ti was like $700. And then if you look at a custom model for like a 980, it would be like close to the price of a 980 Ti. And you're like, that's a really stupid thing to do. Unfortunately for this time around, we don't have a higher tier card that these are bumping up into the next class of card price-wise. So that's kind of the problem with AMD right now, having only one real family of cards, which only includes 2 cards. But you can definitely still bump yourself into the next class of card pricing artificially by just saying, it's $150 or $200 more. Some of these cards are as much as $300 more than the MSRP models, which is really stupid. Now, my initial argument was 304 watt versus 340 watt. That really stinks. You should get the 340 if it can handle 340, and AMD's allowing AIBs to spec them as high as 340. Why not just have them all be 340? But now I'm wondering, again, with the 304 watt matching the 340 watt with a very expensive premium versus MSRP, that logic just sort of flies out the window. It kind of makes buying the more expensive cards kind of dumb, to be honest. I mean, think about it. You pay $150 more for this. I mean, that's a good chunk of change towards like an X3D CPU or a nice CPU, right? It pays for your power supply. It pays for your RAM. I mean, you can pay for a whole nother component in your system with the premium cost of going with the custom board versus a non-custom board. Now, I don't know if all of the MSRP cards are coming in at 304 watt. I kind of feel like they might be, but I don't have those samples to be able to verify. So I highly recommend that you guys check with as much information as you can online about people putting up the true specs of the cards versus just what Tech PowerUp is showing, because Tech PowerUp just shows 9070 XT 304 watt. So unless you find the exact model on the database in Tech PowerUp, you may not know whether you're getting a 304 watt card or a 340 watt card. If it's above MSRP and it's not 340 watt, then you're just getting gouged, honestly, by the manufacturer. Now, it's not traditional type of overclocking though, where having an additional power limit to you does not mean you're going to necessarily get better performance or higher clocks. Sometimes undervolting can lead to better clocks. It's really weird with AMD and the way the architecture is and has been since RDNA first came out. Remember, we are in RDNA 4 now, so this is the 4th gen RDNA, and that whole adage of undervolting often leads to better performance is still appearing to be true. So if that's the case, why would you need any of these guys? You don't. These cards exist because this is where they make their money. There is no money to be had at MSRP. In fact, the MSRP on this one is already appearing to be fake, well, not fake, as much as temporary, if that makes sense. For instance, this exact power color card is still showing on Micro Center's website at $599. Micro Center's the one retailer that really does not change the pricing. They kind of keep it where it is, and they've always been that way. The problem is very few percentage of people watching this channel live near a Micro Center. There's 28 stores, and they have a pretty tight radius around them where people live, and then beyond that, like, people aren't going to drive 5-6 hours to buy a graphics card at MSRP because you just burned all of that savings in gas and lodging and all that crap if you have to travel to get it. And then not to mention Europe and all the other regions that don't have access to anything like that, and then their pricing's already inflated anyway, plus they got VAT and all that other stuff they have to deal with. So it's just kind of a shit show across the board. But the MSRP on this card now, if you start looking online on like Amazon and stuff, is now showing $700. So now it's showing $100 more expensive than it did just last week, because it's starting to look like the MSRPs were almost like an introductory price. Now, AMD says they are not involved in this, but I think AMD might want to if AMD really wants to copy NVIDIA and do good things for the consumer, maybe tighten your leash on your AIB partners to try and keep this sort of thing from happening. Now, technically they can't. Technically, they cannot tell their brands, you can't charge more than this for the product, because AMD is not making this product. AMD only supplied a portion of what's in this product. So you cannot limit the brands from gouging the price. What gives brands an incentive is the fact that they are selling out. And they are selling out because there are more people with deep enough pockets to afford these much higher price points for the class cards that they are, both AMD and NVIDIA, then there are cards available. That's called supply and demand. It is one of the most simple philosophies to understand when it comes to economics. So now we're not going to get into whole macro and microeconomics, so that's a whole different discussion. But the point is, even with tens of thousands of these reaching e-tailers and retailers, Micro Center I think had something like 11,000 of them themselves. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the figure I had heard. And they're all sold out everywhere, tells you the demand is still very high. Unfortunately, all it takes for scalpers to be interested in, doesn't matter if it's shoes or handbags or graphics cards. All it takes is a demand that exceeds quantity for it to pop up on their radar, which is why you're now seeing these scalped as well. So I hate saying that I was right telling AMD you should probably not be so confident in your supply, because they were like, we're gonna have plenty of supply. It's like, well, define plenty. Plenty to me means it'd still be available today on shelves. They've only been out for a handful of days. So again, overconfidence and underdelivered on that one. And then now the crazy pricing that's going up with e-tailers and retailers in various regions saying that the MSRP was only a temporary thing. It was never intended to be a full-time thing, whether that's an AMD involvement or not. Of course, AMD wouldn't want the optics that go along with if they were endorsing that. But again, it's a free market, and that is what we're dealing with today. But I wouldn't be surprised if AMD was involved in some way with the pricing on this, because don't forget, AMD had time to sort of adjust pricing. And I do believe adjust pricing came down to the wire, because we did not get pricing on any of these models until the day before the embargo lift. So we literally had to wait to the last second to film our review about the XFX card, because we had no idea how much it was. Now, all the AIBs found out on February 28th, like everyone else, what the pricing was going to be. That is no joke. Every AIB will tell you the cards had already been manufactured, they were already boxed, they were already palleted, and they were already at their distribution centers and or wholesalers and or retailer warehouses with no known price. Till the 28th, no one on this table knew what the base price was going to be, so they couldn't adjust and base their prices accordingly, because they have to know what the MSRP is first. A lot of us are suspecting the MSRP is very, very aggressive versus what the cost to manufacture even a reference or MSRP card is, making for very little, if any, margin at all. Now, margin means it costs, let's say it costs you $579 to manufacture this card, and you're selling it for $599, that would be a $20 margin. That's actually, believe it or not, about right for many of these cards. $20 of margin in a graphics card is the norm. I know Steve talked about the $4 card EVGA was making for a little while on certain models, but I've had long relationship with EVGA and have had many discussions about margin, and many of the cards are $20 or less. As you are closer to MSRP, the lower the margin is. So to make any sort of money to continue being in business, you would have to sell a lot of them to be able to stay in business. Because not only do you have to have the cost of manufacturing the card, you have to have the cost of the warehousing, the cost of the human resources, the people running the company. Like, they are all considered, drains on funds for the company. So you can't, at $20 a pop, you can't stay in business that way. That's why this stuff exists. And that's also why, because there is such low quantity of these things which appear to be arriving these days, the markups are even larger to make up for the lesser volume. So it's not hard to understand why prices are the way they are. It just sucks because that's the reality of the way things are. And that's before we even talk about things like tariffs and whatever other economic types of sanctions and whatnot may be happening that drive up price when it comes to gathering raw materials and everything else in between. Let's not forget the Vega thing though, where AMD had the whole weird $100 back-end rebate, which nobody understood what the hell that meant, where apparently the AIBs were getting a $100 discount back from AMD on the cost of acquiring the die, which was passed on to the consumer so that they could compete with the NVIDIA card that came out at the time. I can't remember if it was 10 series or I want to say it was either 1080 Ti or it was the 2080. I can't remember. It's right around that time frame. But the only way they could make it work competitively when it was a slower card at gaming, never mind compute. The HBM stuff was amazing at compute, but it was terrible. It was not a great card for gaming. It was power hungry and just did not match the FPS of the price parity card from NVIDIA that was. So they had to make it cheaper, but they couldn't do that full time. So they did this temporary back end rebate for $100 back so that the AIBs would drop the price $100. Now, the crazy part is back then that $100 savings actually made its way to the consumer. I feel like nowadays AIBs would just take the $100 and leave the price the way it is. That's not surprising. That's exactly what I would expect today. So I wouldn't be surprised if AMD at the last minute, which is why we waited all the way till the 28th to find out what pricing was, had to make some adjustments that are cutting into margins so heavily the AIB brands or the AIBs cannot make money at that point, which is why the price is being considered quote unquote fake. So we went from paper launch from NVIDIA where the price looked like competitive-ish, 5090 aside, but like a $999 5080 wasn't terrible considering its performance versus the 4080 at the same price. I mean, it wasn't as much of an uplift as we were hoping for, but it was still more for the same, which would have been nice, except for there was no quantity, which meant the price was artificial, which meant everything went through the roof because of scalping. Now we had quantity for a few days with AMD, and then we had a paper price, which appeared to be ranging anywhere between $599 and $1,000, which is ridiculous. Now they're gone and the price is going up. So, fuck.